Focus brought to you by IG, and we have our friend Paul to talk about maybe not the sexiest story to start off 2024, Paul, but between you and me, I think one of the most interesting stories of the last couple of years and last decade has been this Swiss franc. I know you've been particularly keen to talk about this one in recent weeks because it's gone. I mean, it's never going to be the most reported thing in the world, the Swiss currency, but it's definitely been one of the strongest and a major currency, not only to the U.S. dollar, but as well as the euro and British pound, a really big part of our major pairs.
Yeah. How are you, Frank?
I'm great, man. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. But yeah, the Swiss franc is actually one of the more interesting ones. They haven't had the rate hikes like we've seen around Europe, obviously the EU, but and in Great Britain or the U.S. But they've done a bit different sort of monetary policy there, where they've actually looked to actually sell other currencies that they hold on reserves and buy their own currency back, which is kind of a way they've stabilized their currency and kind of a way they prop up their own currency. So it's a little bit of a different monetary intervention there, but it's also very much a risk-off currency. So that's where, I mean, some of the more recent strength in the Swiss franc, you've seen some of the geopolitical risks that have kind of emerged over the last few months is another reason why you've seen some strength in the franc.
I don't think we need to go any further. That was one of the best descriptions I've ever heard of the Swiss franc, because you're about to see some weird action here that you might not have expected from, a country that's only hiked its interest, correct me if I'm wrong, is around 1.5% to 2%, their interest rates there. Here in the U.S., we got 5% interest rates. In the Euro area, they got 4% interest rates. In the UK, they also have 5%. And so you might expect, oh man, we got to be spanking this franc. Not the case, and I'm glad you highlight not only their differing monetary policy that's still showing a strong country there relative to the U.S. It's obviously been strong over the last 12 to 24 months with its hiking rates to 5%, but also that piece that this franc is a little bit of I don't know if you want to call it like a fear gauge or a flight to quality. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, you can go find the show that we did, correlated it to gold. Swiss franc has been really highly correlated to gold over the course of the last couple of months. You bring in that geopolitical risk piece to it, and I don't think it's any coincidence that we're about to see how strong the Swiss franc has been over the course of the last several years, and gold prices are above $2,000, which is a very rare event for gold. But first, I want to talk about just the fact that forex is this game of relationships and how these currencies relate to each other, constantly changing. And I feel like we get very U.S.-centric for obvious reasons, not only, given where we are here in Chicago, but also it's largest economy in the world, greatest volume in terms of U.S.-based pairs most of the time. Of course, you can't say that bar none, but when you're talking about some of the greatest volume pairs being euro, dollar versus yen, pound, dollar, a lot of that having to do with the large U.S. economy. But you have to keep in mind that globally, as well as domestically here, you and I love to look at the crosses that don't work in that dollar, especially on the higher side of this graphic. You talk about, Swiss franc to euro, pound to Swiss franc, and even the franc to the yen, and we're going to see some really interesting action. But why don't you give us a little bit of a backdrop of the dollar action over the course of, yes, the last decade, but especially the last couple of years, because if you've heard anything about forex or currencies in general, it's been a good few years for dollar.
Yeah, I mean, it's all in the back of rate hikes, higher interest rates in the U.S. as compared to elsewhere. It's always a comparison with these pairs because you're pricing a dollar versus a different pair. In this case, it's the dollar versus the yen. So interest rates in the U.S. have increased dramatically, as you might have noticed, and they haven't actually increased at all in Japan, or at least not yet. But that's what's caused a lot of this momentum. Basically, there's more appetite to hold dollars, less appetite to hold yen, and that's where you get kind of this dramatic price move. We've seen the dramatic price move kind of over the last 2 years, and it really hasn't given much of any of it back.
Yeah, and even, I mean, as recently as the last couple of days, dollar once again, any of these sell-offs that you've seen in dollar the last couple of years, you've seen the buying come in. We'll see if that's the case again this time. But yeah, holding on to a lot of the last couple of years gain and the last decade gain. And I put these numbers together, and we haven't talked about this yet, but I'm interested to see if you were surprised by any of these numbers. This is the dollar's performance relative to the other major currencies over the course of the last decade. I just thought it was interesting that the dollar is up more than 20% across the board. Like, I was expecting to be surprised by CAD or by, pound. And it's actually been just a strong decade for dollar in general, especially that yen. But anything catch your eye on this before we get into the Swiss franc of it all?
Yeah, I mean, it's really mostly just the dollar, how we've kind of handled monetary policy has kind of led to this, and how aggressive the Fed was and how early they were has led to this, and it's kind of why they haven't given up a lot of this. Usually we see some back and forth action in forex where a lot of these outsized gains will be taken back pretty quickly, but this hasn't happened this time around. I mean, even when we get into the Swiss franc, you'll see the D-peg on the chart, which will be the glaring thing in 2015, but that actually you see it reverses pretty quickly. So, but yeah, no, it's nothing really shocking here. It's kind of just what we've noticed over the last 2 years.
It really does feel like we're talking about, the decade here, but the last couple of years is really the bulk, and that's why I think it looks so similar from region to region. And like I said, I'm waiting, Paul, for that surprise from the pound, because I'm like, UK, they got 5% interest rates, and we're just, 25 basis points higher than them. Still 23% appreciation over the last handful of years. Actually, the strongest performer is that euro. Obviously, Brexit weighing on that pound at certain points as well. And then the commodity currencies, Aussie and CAD. But give us a little bit of this backdrop. You talk about the D-peg and the huge move there, obviously glaringly on the left side of this chart. But notice I didn't put that Swiss franc in the last graphic because the dollar's actually down against the Swiss franc in the last decade and also in the last couple of years, even though we have higher interest rates in them.
Yeah, so again, kind of what I highlighted earlier is that they took a little bit different approach to monetary policy. So they hold foreign exchange reserves. So they hold different currencies like the yen, the pound, the euro. And basically what they did is they decided to sell those currencies and buy Swiss franc, which actually props up their currency as a way to fight inflation. So if you look at what the kind of Swiss economy does is they have to import a lot of things. So they're not actually producing a lot of goods. So they have to buy things from different parts of Europe, different goods, especially food. So if you keep the Swiss franc strong, it's actually relatively cheaper to buy outside foreign goods. So that's a lot of what they've done there. Haven't done a whole lot with interest rates. They have hiked a little bit. But also you have this kind of safe haven aspect to the franc that's kind of very, very important. Anytime you see any sort of geopolitical risk, you start to see franc. And historically, if you know that basically the Swiss have stayed out of many kind of global conflicts. And that's kind of why they have this basically flight to quality, safe haven kind of currency status.
Yeah, it is a couple of things working to the favor of this franc. And I wanted to add that context of the dollar performance to those other majors before getting to this, because otherwise, dollar being down 5.5% over the course of a decade looks like nothing, right? You might say this is the most boring market of all time, but when you tie in the dollar appreciation to the tune of 20% or more to those other majors, and then you see this, you're like, what the hell is going on? Because this Swiss franc, I would contend, I think you would as well, is the major that's outside of that top five that's always quoted. And then you look at some of this performance when you tack on the Swiss franc to the yen, to the euro, to the pound, and also Aussie and Canada. And you see an even larger extreme in this franc market to these other crosses. I mean, almost 50% higher against that Japanese yen. And I think we have some data that we're going to show here. Yeah, of course, going back to 2000, this franc, Paul, is worth 2 times more, 100% return here, franc appreciating over the yen. Have you looked at this? Because this is the most extreme chart that I've seen since looking at, Tesla and its run up a couple of years ago, and some of the meme stocks. I mean, this is a crazy chart.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the more wild ones that I don't necessarily follow Swiss franc yen. You could figure it out if you're looking at dollar yen, dollar Swiss franc, but that's probably a rare occurrence. But looking at this, I mean, if you look what's happened over the last 23 years, there's been a lot that's happened, and the Swiss franc is still kind of taking it to the yen no matter what. Even through '08, I mean, even some of that, you see some of that weakness there, but I mean, this thing continued to rally all the way up. I mean, in the last, obviously, 2 years have been quite aggressive. As we know, the yen has not fared well against other currencies.
Yeah, and it's always interesting in my mind, these two are kind of the fear gauges or the flights to quality versus the dollar or versus the euro. And so putting them against each other, you would almost expect it to be a wash, like unchanged. They both go up when there's times of fear. They both go down when there's not times of fear. But yeah, you see around the '08 financial crisis, and then you remember some of the stock downside that was seen in the middle part of 2015, and you see the selling in franc, but only for a handful of months, and more up into the right action. Now, on the other side of things, now that we've looked at all these different angles, we've got Swiss franc, the strongest of the major currencies for the last decade. I did want to bring up this dollar franc once again, just to show relatively how less volatile this market is, because of course, extremes are what a lot of traders look to, especially people who are trading for weeks or months or even years. They'll hold positions. But maybe you don't want a market that can, over the course of a few years, move 20, 30, 40, 50%. Forex being highly leveraged, those are big moves. Here, this dollar franc, you've got an extreme here that is still in the favor of the franc, but much less volatile. I mean, Paul, outside of a couple of months here and there, this is a market that's largely been trading in 1,000, 1,500 pip range over the course of the last decade plus.
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at that period from 2015 to 2020, it traded in a 500, maybe just outside of a 500-point range for 5 consecutive years. That's nothing. It's hardly moving over that period of time. It is not, I mean, even if you look at the last 2 years, the fact that it has now moved 1,500 points is interesting that it's moved that far. And we'll see if we settle and kind of here and get back to this range bound that you kind of saw for the 2015 to 2020, or if it continues with the volatility, it's going to kind of be an interesting one to watch. I remember vividly that day. One of the more volatile days of 2022 was you saw Swiss franc. It was that big red candle there. That's down. It was down 3%, more than 300 points on the day. It was like, where did this come from? Because that's not something you expect out of Swiss franc. So that's an interesting one. Definitely going to be an interesting one to watch going forward with all the changes in monetary policy.
I would agree with you. It's always crazy to see, like I say, like a meme stock type chart, or like a Tesla type chart, or a crypto type chart. But this is almost like seeing a Microsoft that's down, maybe not it's not been cut in half or doubled like a meme stock, but down 10, 20%. Here, this price extreme in a lesser volatile market. And I thought I might as well put together here a little matrix. Of course, any of these markets can go anywhere. There's, risk to any of these strategies, and we're just showing both sides of each of these markets. But yeah, if you're looking for a contrarian trade, obviously you'd want to get on the short side of the Swiss franc. If you're looking for a trend follower trade, Paul, you'd want to be on the long side of the Swiss franc, strongest of the last decade. And if you're looking for a high volatile piece, that franc yen is, out of the majors, I mean, that's got to be the most volatile market that you've seen out of those major crosses, right?
Yeah, definitely one that's going to be continue to be watched. Bank of Japan is, I believe they're scheduled to do their first rate hike, but I've heard now that they're going to possibly put it off after an earthquake that happened earlier this week in Japan. So there's some already uncertainty. I mean, there's always uncertainty if they're actually going to hike rates or not. They've said they're going to and haven't kind of pulled through on that yet. So that's another one that's going to be, it should be volatile. And then the franc, I believe, are kind of pulling back from their kind of strong franc policies as inflation has come down across the euro region.
And if they pull back a little bit faster or more aggressively than the U.S., then maybe you get that mean reversion, that contrarian play. But yeah, the lower volatility piece being that dollar Swiss franc that, like we say, has been in a 1,000 to 2,000 pip range for the last decade, essentially. So a lot to look at. Strongest currency of the decade, the franc. Paul, thanks so much. Great information on that Swiss franc front.